the University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Neo Morojele, and I'm currently going to be introducing to you, Professor Saurabh Sinha, the Deputy Vice Chancellor here at the University of Johannesburg. And following his presentation, I will be taking you through the rest of the afternoon. So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Saurabh Sinha to you this afternoon. Professor Sinha is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Internationalization at the University of Johannesburg, and he's been in this position since 2017. Prior to this, Professor Sinha was appointed as the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment here at the University of Johannesburg as well. Before joining UJ, Professor Sinha spent over a decade in senior positions at the University of Pretoria, most notably in the Department of Electrical, Electronic and Computer Engineering. Professor Sinha has numerous senior positions in both local and international organizations. For example, he's currently a fellow of the prestigious association referred to as IEEE. This stands for the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering. Professor Sinha has also served on numerous other capacities on the IEEE, including having been the Vice President for educational activities on that association. And then locally, Professor Sinha is very well known. He's a member of the South African NRF board, and he chairs the Research Development Committee of the NRF board. Professor Sinha has published extensively. We know we're familiar with some of his work. He's authored and co-authored over 130 peer-reviewed journal articles. He's presented at numerous international conferences and also publishes in outlets which are intended for the members of the public, including the well-known The Conversation outlet. Professor Sinha has also been the recipient of numerous international and national awards, and he's very, very passionate about both capacity development and research within the higher education sector. There's really indeed a lot to say about Professor Sinha, and we are very, very pleased that he's here today and he's able to present to us, Professor Sinha. So we look forward to your presentation entitled Contextualizing the Journey to Professorship. So I'd like to hand over now to you, Professor Sinha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Morojele, for the introduction. And good afternoon once again. Phase 2 of the Future Professors program. And as I was coming into this venue, Dr. Menon and I were chatting, and she was just telling me how wonderful the speakers were this afternoon, or this morning rather, putting some pressure on me to be either better, but I was more worried what happens if I contradict the earlier speakers. And so I thought about it, that you have more, as speakers come into the afternoon, there will be some contradictions. And of course, you know it, that the speakers who speak last have the last word. So Professor Neo Morojele, I understand you will be speaking after me. so thank you very much once again. Colleagues, I want to contextualize the journey, and I noticed when we were talking about the journey that it may not be the, but it may be a journey, because our journeys are so different. They're different for different reasons, and that's maybe one of the things that I had also noted, is that it may not be one particular path. There may in fact be multiple and different paths. So I asked Dr. Menon, how and what do I do, and present in what would be the most appropriate angle. And the angle that I, and with her guidance, decided to take is the angle that I have myself pursued, but also with some nuances of what I have learned in terms of the pursuit of some of the others. As we do engage across the institution, and as always, and as at every moment, we continue to learn from one another So I think that the first aspect is that the quest of the professor is in fact to seek disciplinary depth. But I like to nuance this a little to say that we also must have transdisciplinary breadth. Earlier this morning, although I didn't attend Professor Chilitsi Marwala's presentation, but I did see that he had included his book on leadership, which you have also received a copy of. There's a very nice chapter there that talks about the attributes and how the future world of work continues to change, and how we as academics play a crucial role in those changes. So the aspect of the transdisciplinary, I put that here because we do talk about quite a bit about disciplinary. Then there is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary. I also talk a bit about cross-disciplinary in my presentation, which is leveraging the strength or the maturity of certain concepts in one discipline and applying that maturity to another discipline. So a couple of these definitions will come, and some of these definitions also overlap. But I put down transdisciplinary because this is one that has particular relevance, maybe in both in the humanities and social sciences, but also in science, engineering, and technology. And the way that I see it is that it is when the real world, I use inverted commas, of non-governmental organizations, of government organizations, the industry or the private sector, how they interact with the university space in also shaping up what we do enables impact outside of our environments. I just want to change the spotlight a bit. Okay, great. So the next area is that you've been, again, thinking, and some of you are senior lecturers, others of you are associate professors. And so this is really a recap of what it is that you know, that we do as a university, the aspects of teaching, research, and service, broadly speaking. But I wanted to emphasize, particularly when it comes to the area of research, the aspect of impact. I bring this up particularly as Neo introduced me earlier also from a perspective of my role at the National Research Foundation. We have recently developed the new strategy, which was adopted by the board last year, and the strategy really talks to 4 pillars: transformation, impact, excellence, and sustainability. I talk about these 4 pillars here because these are 4 pillars that the National Research Foundation intends to amplify in its journey to 2030. So some of those areas will also be of interest to you. The aspect of impact is something that is looked at broadly. So it is not only impact in the sense of academic citations. That is one element and one way of defining impact. But other elements of impact includes socioeconomic impact. And incidentally, we as a university are also developing an impact committee. And I joke with them sometimes because they must have impact in our setting. But what we intend to do there is actually to look at these diverse forms of impact, and especially when it comes to contextualizing in the South African setting. So, for me, in my own research work, the question that has been coming about, which I've constantly asked, is that, say there's a particular proposal, then the question is, so what? What is the relevance of that proposal in the knowledge body? What is the relevance of that proposal when it comes to our national setting, but then also from an international perspective? And sometimes there is a local strength, like we find in indigenous knowledge areas, and we then scale that interest into a global area. Also, I think the need for being open-minded is also of interest. I'll give you one example. South Africa is host to the Tautona mines. It is a fairly deep mine of over about 4 kilometers. If you go down in the earth 4 kilometers, you may find different kind of minerals. Maybe that is the main reason why that depth is brought about. But interestingly, colleagues and friends, when researchers went into those depths, they found different kind of formulations of unicellular organisms, which they had not expected, or multicellular organisms in different depths. And so when they started to go into this depth, by the way, this was, of course, again, an example of how one discipline or one experiment can lend to another. And that actually led into a paper in Nature by some colleagues actually in South Africa. And so you can see that at times, there is a applied focus, but outside of that, there comes new knowledge areas or new knowledge bodies that get defined. So the aspect of impact. So the takeaway here is really to, in fact, also think in terms of the impact of the work. Now, I do come from electronic engineering, which is a very special, and to make it worse, but don't worry, it won't be too bad. To make it worse is I come from a subdiscipline of microelectronics, which is quite a super specialization when it comes to this discipline. So I thought that I should say a few words about how my own journey began. My journey actually began from an entity called Kentron, which was actually a sponsor at one time of my undergraduate studies. And Kentron, for many of you will, I think, not be less familiar with it. It actually comes from the defense sector. It is now called, today, it is called peacekeeping. But at one stage, it was from the defense sector. And they were really in the business of making missiles. I was not so keen, but the electronic aspect of it was interesting. And you will see how my work then developed further. But one of the problems that there was, so you will notice initially that the work is more problem-based, and then it develops, and I will explain that in 2 or 3 slides. So the problem that these folks were trying to solve in the defense sector at one stage was actually the problem that missiles, fortunately or unfortunately, are not used on all the time. They're used maybe once in 10 years or so. And so inside of these missiles, there is a communication headset, a communication device that looks, by the way, if you open your cell phone or you open one of these devices, you will find the guidance system typically looks like a board like these. These are just some images to illustrate some of the thinking that comes about. I will move very quickly from the technology side, so don't worry, you won't get lost. And so this, the communication system then looks something like this. And then I zoom into this, it looks something like this device. And if you further go into this, you find that there's a device with multiple layers. Now, what was the problem that was happening with these missiles when it was not being used for a number of years, because it's typically deployed once and that's it, was that inside of this chip, there were a number of layers, and these layers, they used to sag over time. If you think about a sandwich, you place a sandwich, outside once it has been made, you find that the layers of the bread will in fact sag. And that was kind of the problem that was happening in these missiles over time. And so we then started to look at it and said, how do we actually solve this problem? And some of the solutions actually come from different disciplines. And in areas such as in civil engineering, you see that when buildings are built, they are built with these pillars. And if you look at burgers or sandwiches, sometimes they have toothpicks, sometimes there are multiple layers, and they have even a toothpick going through it. So when you see something like this, you actually see that there is a very simple solution, which is then the solution that got deployed in these layers within the chip, so that over time, one can actually prevent sagging. Of course, technically, we do something slightly different, but this is just to illustrate the principle. Colleagues, the point I wanted to make here today in this particular slide is really that some of these problems that we see are actually the solutions may not necessarily be in that particular discipline. The solutions may in fact be coming from observations or from areas that have come about in other domains. Now, I myself, and some of you may also experience this, that we are all so busy today that we barely get time to have a pause. We barely get time to take sabbaticals. And I hope, colleagues, that during this Future Professors program, you do get time to take a pause. And I hope that your institutions will support you through this program to take a pause, to allow you to take a sabbatical, so that you can move away from the day-to-day tasks that you're doing and have the ability to interact with academics from other domains and disciplines. This, for me, was of great value. Speaking to folks in human resources, in home economics, different domains at the institution was something that was always very valuable. And I actually made time for doing that. It was difficult, but one actually had to make time. I want to give another example, still relating to aspects around these engineering principles. Here is again this integrated circuit, and if you look between these pins, you probably notice what most people just will take space or air. What we have been able to see in our group is that it is not just air, but it is in fact an electronic component that is in there, which is called a capacitor. And once we start to understand how this space is used, we can do a lot of very clever and complicated things from what simply Mother Nature gives to us. So for me, this aspect around biomimicry, to just think about what is nature, what are the innovations in nature, what is it that Mother Nature gives us, how can we have better understanding of those kind of empty spaces, and then better use that so that we can devise, in this case, certain technical components. And this is now a separate example, which is a work that one of my friends who works in the area of cooling in electronic engineering deals with, and he just loves to go to different parts of the Karoo of Namibia and observe animals. And one of his breakthroughs came about by simply observing that the way that the gemsbok, the way that it controls its temperature, is by elevating its body temperature to more than what its ambient temperature is, or equal to its ambient temperature. And by doing that, it is able to reduce its perspiration. This observation was implemented in the way that you do cooling in certain electronic devices. So you can again see that a lot of my own work and observation is really from what is it that nature does. And I have a motto that I try and live by, which is that many complex problems actually have very simple solutions. And this extends, I think, across multiple domains. And of course, some complex problems have complex solutions, which is fine because they interact with multiple disciplines. You can easily have unintended consequences. And I think that the area of the fourth industrial revolution is particularly a complex problem or a complex opportunity, because on the one end, you have this huge advantage of what data gives you. On the other hand, you have the aspect of data ethics, because data sets have the ability to collaborate with each other. We often talk about, in our setting in South Africa, decolonization of knowledge, but we are now also, and we have just finished a paper on colonization by algorithms. So you can see that there are at times opportunities in these complex problems, and there are also complex problems that comes about. And at times we have to think about, and there is, by the way, also solutions that's emerging when it comes to things like colonization by algorithms, which is integrating ethics into the way that computational thinking occurs. But I mentioned some of these things because the way that the disciplines come together, I think for me is quite interesting and fascinating, despite how technical these disciplines at times appear to be. Now, I was busy with some of this work in the early 2000s. It was very interesting because these different companies and industries, they were approaching us and they would say, Saurabh, what about solving this? We looked at dam water levels and they said, well, there is the current solution. It's hard to maintain. Can we look at new solutions? There were lots of these questions and requests coming up to the university. It was interesting, but then it created a bit of a problem. And I reflected on this problem as I was walking out of a graduation ceremony, and my dean at the time, Professor Rolf Sannenberg, he asked me, so Saurabh, what are you busy with? And I could give him multiple answers. And then he said, okay, no, that's fine. And then he said, but, you know, tell me, what are you looking to really be busy with? And then I started to give again some answers. And then he says, so what is your timeline for some of this thinking? And at the time, I was a lecturer moving to a senior lecturer role. And I said to him that, you know, Prof. Sannenberg, my idea is actually, this is a timeline of 18 months. And he looked at me and he was very shocked. And he said, well, I'm actually asking you about what is your projection in the next 45 years. And suddenly I realized that the disciplinary depth that we were talking about was actually at a different level altogether in this question. I want to pause a bit there. And I want to talk about my experience. I attend these NRF award ceremonies, sometimes as a DVC, but other times as NRF board members, but also to celebrate the achievements of academics at UJ, but also at other universities. In 2019, I was meeting with some of the A-rated professors, and I said to them, you know, what do you know, I see you've got an A rating in this. Sometimes they moved from A2 to A1. It was quite fascinating. And I said, so what are you planning to? Now, many of these colleagues were in their 60s or so, or 70s, sometimes even in the early 70s. And I said, so what's your next plan to do next now? And one person said, well, you know, I really need more time in the work that I'm doing, because for the next maybe 30 years or so, I need to be working. And one of our own professors who deals in the respiration of birds said, well, there's still a lot of work to be done. And I said, you know, how long have you been working in this? And he said, well, for about 45 years. And immediately I started to realize that, you know, disciplinary depth does take time to develop. But maybe there are some advantages in the way that we can progress a discipline today. The power of computational technology, I think, is a new advancement that has come about, which gives us a leverage to perhaps even go back to old knowledge areas and see if the technology and the computational power gives us access to new knowledge domains. Incidentally, I then had to take a pause with what I was doing. Lots of consulting work was coming, and they were you know, financially rewarding and things, but I had to take a pause to reflect on what the dean had asked me in this casual conversation going out of the graduation ceremony. And so in this pause, I said to myself, well, you know, where is actually, you know, the technology was miniaturizing. It was very clear that devices were becoming smaller and smaller. And one of the trajectories that I recognized was this aspect of these Gs. Now, let me talk about these Gs. So telecommunication devices, your cell phone that you had prior to 1990, they were called 1G. First generation between 1990 and 2000, they were called 2G. The advancement brought about the SMSs. Then it was 3G, which allowed for some level of data communication, which was between 2000 and 2010. And 2010 onwards was 4G, which is essentially your cell phone, which is more or less a computer. Then when you have computer in your pocket, as well as a desktop or a laptop, and all of these devices start to communicate, it creates a explosion of data, which is then referred to as 5G, which started in 2020. But the instance here is that every 10 years, right? Every 10 years, there's a new G that was coming out. So in 2030, there will be a 6G. So it's typically this 10-year period. So I said to myself that, well, in 2020, there will be this era of 5G telecommunications, and what must we start to do in order to find some solutions? And when I started to talk to people, they said, well, technology wasn't quite moving. And they said, well, I think it's quite crazy to even think about it. So I said, well, some of us must actually pursue things that are a little bit crazy and a little bit of that. And so I then started to pursue this area in 5G telecommunications. We started the work in 2006. One technology, I'm not going to go into detailed technology areas, it's called millimeter wave, which is the area that I then pursued to try to really answer this disciplinary depth question. And incidentally, when Neo introduced me earlier as an IEEE fellow, I was recognized as 300 out of 400,000 members around the world that are recognized each year. And it was actually for a very specialist sub-technology that enables this 5G telecommunications. And I also got rated by the NRF for some of this work. But of course, the NRF rating at the time, and I did agree with the reviewers, was insufficiently focused. Simply because even in this discipline, you're often borrowing from the observations from other disciplines, and there is room to do that. I share this feedback quite openly because those of you that are going for NRF rating is something to keep in mind. And some of you are already rated, of course. But now, going back into this 2006 period or 7 period, and when we were looking at defining our research group, I ran into some interesting problems. One was that the funding that I was mostly getting was actually from the defense industry. And that industry was not interested in telecommunications. So I had to kind of embed the work that I was doing. So the silicon germanium is also relevant in the defense industry. So I had to use funding from that to establish what were the principles that would also be applicable when it comes to 5G telecommunications. So it was a bit of a platform that was born out of funding coming from the defense industry, but then to progress a different agenda, which is to develop telecommunication devices. This is kind of, because these are very expensive areas of work and there were not that many other avenues to fund. The funding was very important in this domain, and it's very, very costly. To give you an idea, a little chip that we produce, which is maybe 4 millimeters square, we used to have to pay R1 million to be able to produce that chip. And it would be, it would be prototyped, and then it would return to South Africa, we'd do measurements, and then there would be issues with it. And so it's a fairly costly exercise. Now, there was a bit of a catch-22 process here, because unless we had measured results, journals were giving us this experience, and many of you are used to this experience. This is the transition of a paper in the peer review process. And when you submit into a journal that maybe, 4 in 100 papers or so will be accepted. So we know that this is very, very tough. And sometimes you get, after 2 years, you get a 1-sentence feedback that will say, well, it is not accepted. Your paper was out of scope or something like that, right? And so sometimes, and the reason why I'm again sharing this is because I really want to bring the association that these are difficulties that we all experience, and we have all experienced that. So a major feedback that I was observing when we were submitting papers was that, sorry, you do not have measurement results, and the paper would come back with a big fat reject. And then I started to say, this is actually a problem, because the dean has given me this assignment to develop a claim to fame. but it seems impossible because we don't have the way to afford these very expensive systems and so on. So incidentally, I had also on the side joined an organization called this IEEE that was mentioned by Neo, which is a professional society. And it's kind of a very big network, in this case, of engineers, of 400,000 engineers around the world in over 160 countries. And these individuals also had a footprint in South Africa, so I decided to become active in that network. And that network then brought about at local conferences and international conferences, collaborators from around the world, and some of those who were also interested in the technologies that I was interested in. And incidentally, there were groups from Germany and Romania that I really met at one of the conferences. Incidentally, one of the conferences that I really enjoyed was a conference at the Kruger National Park. People in my family couldn't believe that I was going to the Kruger National Park for a conference. They thought I was going for what they call contourism. I believe the word means a conference plus tourism. And I arrived at this Kruger Park, and it was really a wonderful, it was not a big conference, it was a small conference with one series. People didn't really leave the conference venues during the day. You know, it's a little bit like having a conference in a ship. People don't tend to leave the conference. You know, if you have a conference in Johannesburg or Cape Town, you find that people go into the city and you don't always see them at the conference. But in the Kruger Park, generally, you don't leave conference rooms. You find animals if you do, and they are quite dangerous. So it was very good networking opportunity. And I then attended and visited with these folks. The conference was not too strenuous. It was typically between 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. But what was very nice was that at about 5 in the morning, you would go out for a tour of the park, and you would see the animals. It was very hot, of course, during the time of our conference then. And during that time, I started to engage with some of our collaborators. And I will say that one of my lead collaborators came out of that conference, incidentally from Romania. And I say that because it was a very interesting angle. It was not something I had known or understood. I was quite young at the time. I didn't really understand the politics of grant applications. And one thing I noticed about these folks from the eastern part of Europe was that they were moving into the European Union. It was still maybe 7-8 years before the member countries were signing up. And that meant that they had quite a few incentives when it came to ordering of equipment and collaborating, say Romania with Germany, with Belgium. And then interestingly, South Africa, for historical and other reasons, could also be part of some of these European Union grants. And the one grant was a framework program 7, FP7 grant application. And those applications were, and even right now, are fairly large grant applications. Typically, you'll apply for, say, $2 million or €2. And so those were the kind of grants that would be applied. They would be applied in a consortia. So although the overarching grant may be large, but the grants will then divide among the different member institutions. But I give you all of this extra information because sometimes we don't always have the appreciation for what conferences can mean, and then also how the collaboration develops. And so we had a grant application from there, which then led to, and also, of course, the professional networks was the key. And that then led, it didn't lead to a situation where we could buy our own equipment, but it led to a situation where I could send my students to Romania. I could travel to Romania, to Germany, and to different programs. And one instrument that was very valuable was a program called KIC, still exists, called Knowledge Interchange Program of the NRF. It's not big grants, it's small grants just to allow mobility. And that was a very key enabler because it meant that now my people could go, I could go, and we could do our measurements of these integrated circuits. And the measurements then opened the next door, which was our struggle with the journal papers was finally overcome. We could include measurement results, validate our work, and then our paper started to get accepted. It was a big breakthrough when it happened. And then of course, after some time, you start to develop a number of papers, you start to thread them together, it starts to develop a cultivated story. And then I went to our own Department of Science and Innovation. At the time, it was called Department of Science and Technology, through the National Research Foundation, and started to apply for some equipment. This is one equipment that was funded, which was about 10 million rands, and then another equipment that was funded was a probe station. And it really became an amazing network, because I initially said that, to produce these chips, you paid 1 million rands. We established relationships with different foundries around the world that then started to support, that they started to sponsor in kind that we can produce these chips. So we were sending these chips to these foundries in the US, in Taiwan, in Italy, and they would then do our prototyping. They would come back, we would do the measurements. And this then became a very important journey into the way that our publications, our acceptance rate improved. And it was all because it was one step leading to the other. But remember that I could have easily given up after 3 years of rejections and said, hey, maybe I just need to now look at a different field. And some people do that, and it works out, and that's fine as well. Our resilience levels also tend to differ. But I will say that all of this, really, the people relationship was very key. So I remember that when we were trying to get sponsorship, I applied to IBM to get prototyping sponsored to IBM in the US for 7 years. I was rejected for 7 years. Then someone told me, but maybe IBM just doesn't understand what you guys are doing in South Africa. Maybe you need to invite people. And so I said, okay, let's try that. And so I went and used the knowledge interchange program of the NRF. And then I invited some individuals, and they came by to South Africa. We also went to the Kruger National Park on the side. And then I took them through the lab work. I took them through the advanced scientific work that we do in South Africa. And they were it was like amazing for them that, South Africa is doing this advanced kind of work. And that is what they said, well, we will give you the chance for 1 year to do some prototyping. And then if it works, then we will continue. By the way, to this day, I have granting options from IBM in terms of being able to develop some of these prototypes. So it will really, the aspect of, so perhaps the takeaway here is not only the equipment, but the takeaway here is the relationships aspects that developed of people who are truly interested in advancing science, but working in an international system. So you can see several books came out of this. You will notice they're all in this millimeter wave. This is really the area in which I play, and I keep to that. I work in some other areas as well, but when it comes to the main areas, we had some new work in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, simply because the fourth industrial revolution makes it, increases the volumes of communication, which creates the problem that then needs to be solved using 5G telecommunications. And millimeter wave is one of the underlying technologies of 5G. We also started to question and say, well, 5G is here today, and we are discussing and slowly implementing it, also understanding the complexities in the health areas of 5G. But then what about 6G? And we actually put together the first one of the first texts. There are not that many around the world on 6G, which was published actually just around Valentine's Day this year. So you will notice that a large part of the work has been around the research components. I want to just recap a couple of things here. One is that the diversity of the team was very important, different kinds of diversity. Gender diversity, the racial diversity, international diversity. Most of our postdocs have been from outside of the country, so they have often seen different dimensions of the problem. Sometimes they have seen the problems even before they have occurred. There may be certain stigma, for example, as associated to technology, and they are very important to consider, because if we are talking about, for example, inequality, if you look into the lens of inequality, you may see the aspect of digital inequality, particularly in countries like South Africa. Then comes the next question is, how do you actually design cost-effective technologies? And then how do you then develop the policy framework for those cost-effective that incentivizes your mobile cellular providers such that you can deliver data at low or at no cost, for example, when it comes to elements of education. So it all is intertwined, and sometimes when you have a postdoc coming from the UK, where they may have explored some of these issues, or you may have a postdoc coming from Kenya, which has also got quite a bit of advancement when it comes to ICT policies. So it's really been this whole grouping that has come together. Then our postgraduate students, research fellows. When a postgraduate student joins me as at honors or at masters, I immediately say, you are a research fellow, and it becomes a lifelong relationship that establishes. When I presented some of these books, you will notice some have been published with Dr. Bozanic. He graduated with his PhD about maybe 10 years before or maybe not 10, maybe about 8 years before the book has come about. The book is on a different topic. We simply continued our professional engagements, and that's really how. So maybe the area here is actually to have these relationships in a sustained way. Then the next aspect deals with international exchanges. I just want to give you one highlight. I got a grant to invite some students from China, from a university in Chengdu, in the Sichuan province, which also had, some of you may remember, it was devastated with earthquake. It was actually just around that period when these students were invited. I invited about 6 students. It was funded between an agreement between the South African and Chinese government. There was a bilateral arrangement. And these students came in, and we gave them some assignments. It was very interesting because the assignments I gave to these students were for 3 months, and most of these students from China, coming from Chengdu, completed these assignments in a period of 2 weeks. So immediately, my own students who were working with them on similar assignments were challenged by how to now kind of compete with this group. So I'm just putting in that one angle that came about when students from these different places came about. It developed a competitive angle for my students. And my students then, some of them wanted to go to China to understand how it is that it works there. I also needed to integrate some proofreaders because language was quite important. The journals we were working in, if you write in UK English, they will reject the paper because it's in the US English. And so the proofreaders also needed to have this nuanced understanding of the landscape of journal publishing, and also the bias and the perception and all of those aspects associated. Professional networks, I've talked quite a bit about joining, a professional society or a council in your area. Research funding I've talked about, and I also talked about the problems when you align your research too closely with industry, because you lose your freedom of what it is that you want to do, and then you have to kind of carve quite creatively how you will be able to use the platform of that funding to do your own kind of curiosity-oriented work. Of course, once you then build the track record around that, then funding, we do find funding. I also want to talk a little bit about research structures. Sometimes we feel that, there must be you must be in a research group or a complicated center or institute. It needn't necessarily be, at times you may have people working with you in the institution, at times with people working at the institution, but also at other institutions. And this whole area of research structures has virtualized. You do have to be a lot more careful with intellectual property arrangements, given the IPR Act in South Africa and also in other parts of the world. But a lot of collaborations. And I think once you know and have the relationship, the rest of it can be worked. I also want to just indicate that collaborative tools, and I use in an extensive way tools such as OneDrive and SharePoint to coordinate my editorial work with my students, with my collaborators, with my peers, and across different time zones. It's just the nature of the work. And I must say, if I was not using these collaborative tools, I would be spending hours and days and nights. I still remember to print different documents and try and see what change person X has made, what change person Y has made. And all of that now can be automated with the right tools such as OneDrive. If you use Google products at your institution, Google Drive. And I must say that for me personally, it has really, it saves enormous amounts of time once one gets used to these tools. It does take some time getting used to that. And the global engagement or internationalization, I gave some examples about that earlier. If you are in the science, engineering, technology disciplines, the aspect of innovation is quite key. And one of the things that happened from my research group in 2008 was a company called Insiava that was born out. It was initially funded by the Innovation Fund at about 45 million rands. And in fact, it is still in existence today. It is called Insiava. In fact, two of my master's students still works there, and the CEO is a student I supervised, in fact, at his undergraduate level, and then also went on to completing his PhD. And so that's another element. If you have it, that's maybe another way of making impact outside of conventional ways. The next aspect, which is the aspect of teaching. I find it, even as a DVC, I find it very difficult to actually say, well, I won't be teaching. I am involved in teaching at the moment in microelectronics programs in South Africa. I also do guest lectures for institutions in other places. I find that very fulfilling. I find that, I just have the need, when you have these very difficult solutions that you sometimes solve 5 years later, that you want to kind of talk about it and explain how you solved it, sometimes at conferences, but also sometimes at more detail through student engagement and the interaction between students and staff. And I must say that I am learning quite a lot from my undergraduate and postgraduate students through the project work that they are doing. They do approach things in a very different way relative to the way that I have done in the past. And so that's been a very fulfilling and a learning experience for me. But because time is always so limited in what we are doing, I also introduced something called, at least in my group, it's not a new concept at all. It's used I think many of you are probably using it, is the aspect of vertical integration and supervision. Something that I experienced and benefited from my postgraduate supervisors, particularly Monica du Plessis, was really considered to be the father of electronics in South Africa. And because of that, he was so busy. If you see him for maybe 20 minutes in a year, you may be lucky. And so what he did was that he had master students who he coupled to me, and then later on PhD students. And then I became his person to start working and networking with others in different research groups, in our research group, but different subdisciplines of the group. And it immediately became a takeaway for me that the best way that we learn is by doing, learning by doing. And so I involve my students as they become very good and say in a writing style, then I immediately involve them with honor students or with master students. And I think one thing that has really been another very helpful tool for me is to do recording of certain techniques and then use online learning or the recordings to help in advancing certain concepts. I have some students who are overseas, like in Australia, and then we start to deal with different time zones. 3 o'clock in South Africa is 8 o'clock in the morning in some parts of Oz. And so the recording components is also something that, of course, during the COVID-19 period, we've all learned that it's not really an option. I did talk about this already. This is really about 4IR. And sometimes 4IR has this feeling of the icing on the cake. But what we are trying to do is also use these technologies of the fourth industrial revolution in finding new and deeper areas of knowledge that we simply haven't been able to access otherwise. So I think I already gave that example. The last part of my presentation deals with service. I started at the time I was at University of Pretoria, we started to develop our program in community-based learning. It was heavily disputed because the view was that, if you make it compulsory, does it mean like medical doctors that when people graduate, then they must do community service? That was not the intention when we introduced it for engineering students at the University of Pretoria. We introduced it because we recognized that many engineering students were really working in one discipline, and also because of the landscape of South Africa, you can actually find yourself even today that you can graduate, say, from University X and get a job in the same city and be in the city and live and even go on holidays internationally, but not realize that 5 or 10 kilometers from where your work is or where you live, there is a township. It became very important for us to give students this realization by requesting students from this, that were coming from one suburb to experience work and solve problems in another suburb or in another area. And I'll give you one example of a problem that we were looking at, which was to use solar cells to provide electrification in a small village in Botswana, in Central District in Botswana, in Ditlakane. We were trying so we went there and we deployed solar solutions. As engineers typically do, is they sometimes drop a solution. And then we went 6 months later to do an assessment. And then we found in the assessment that we had failed. All the equipment that we had put, the people in the village had put everything aside. And then it became quite something for us to learn and understand what happened. In engaging with the people in the area, we learned it was kind of obvious that this was also a mosquito area, and what was happening was people were using and cooking and the cooking that they were doing was producing smoke, and the smoke was keeping mosquitoes away. And some of those mosquitoes were the Anopheles mosquito, which brought about malaria. And so we brought about the technology and came about more malaria. And people in these areas the lifespan was not very long. And so, there were no medical doctors or so in the area. And so these kind of, it was an unintended consequence of technology, which we thought were trying to help, but then it really created a number of other problems. We solved the problem, again, using technology. But had we, right at the outset, had a deeper engagement with, what were the different problems, with speaking with Nkosi, with taking colleagues from the social sciences with us together when we went to have our first engagement, probably we would have picked up some of these issues. So what my big takeaway from these community engagements was the aspect of the blend between the disciplines of humanities and social sciences and of SET. And I think after doing quite a bit of work, incidentally through the IEEE network, we also made the engineering projects in community service a global endeavor together with Purdue University and IEEE. And if you Google it, you will actually notice that it is still a program that remains active internationally, but it looks at problems that you can solve in communities through a transformative or a transdisciplinary approach. A couple of the elements then also feed into the Sustainable Development Goals, which then has become a major part of how we are doing things at UJ, but also at many universities where you are present, is to use the congruent lenses that the Sustainable Development Goals offers. But I think for me, the service aspect outside of just, the professional development that one acquires within, say, engineering-related societies, there are a number, in different disciplines, was also to kind of have a pause from one's own work, but to think outside of the box about the intended as well as unintended consequences of what we do from a technology perspective. And I think 5G is a great example of where you see health-related and policy-related questions that are emerging. Lastly, I think the aspect of professional recognition and NRF rating. I know that the NRF rating, your views are most likely very diverse, but for me, the big aspect of this rating and these professional recognitions is actually to get feedback from peers at an international level, but being quite open-minded that sometimes when you get the feedback, you may not agree with that feedback, but as I think it was Mandela that at one point said that impossible is just a bad way of, well, he's got a couple of phrases, he had a couple of phrases about impossible, but one of them also had to do with how impossible is I am possible. And so I think, so for me, that has been the aspect around attaining feedback from these different instruments. Of course, journal articles are one way of getting feedback as well, and just developing one's resilience and taking the feedback as a learning step. So in summary, I think the aspect of your journey, and I put your in italics, because our journeys are shaped differently, and sometimes the pace of our journeys can be very different. I started as a research assistant, and after 12 years, I exited University of Pretoria as an extraordinary professor, as a full professor. I don't know if I would want to do the journey in the same way. I might want to do it differently today. And so, of course, from a hindsight perspective, but what I would say is that, cultivating the journey, but I think the most important part is, at least for me, has always been, the people that comes into this journey, how we work with our students, our collaborators, and how those relationships, develop over time, how these individuals view the work, how they view ourselves, how they view us, how they view me, I think has been a very important aspect of reflection, of, changing my approach all the time. One has to really be open to learning from these experiences and ultimately building knowledge domains. But I think the excitement that comes about from all of this, I think is really kind of the end goal of this. And then, of course, the knowledge body that comes about, how it integrates and how that knowledge body develops symbiotic relationships with other knowledge bodies. I think seeing all of that come together, I think is very fulfilling. And of course, future professor as a person, but also about defining knowledge domains that matter in our context, but then in the global context as well. So that is it. That is my story. It's a little longer than what I'd expected, but I hope that has given you some ideas and insights and appreciations. And I would love if there are any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Well, Professor Sinha, that was truly fascinating and inspiring. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you very much for sharing your particular journey. It has indeed been very, very interesting to listen to your journey. It was very comprehensive, I believe, and I think it's given us a lot of food for thought in so many different ways, in so many different areas. And I suspect that amongst us, there are probably lots of ideas that have been generated based on what you've said. And I suspect that also much of what you've said now will have significance not only today, but as our participants go through their journey over the next 2 years. So rather than share my own reflections, I think what we can do now is to open up for discussion, which is the intention, and to give our participants a chance to ask questions, to share their reflections, and so on. Because I think you've said a lot, and I think that there's really much to be discussed. So I suppose what we can do now is just to give participants an opportunity. I'll just check if there are any hands. If you would like to, Professor Sinha, I was expecting to have to share and let you know that the time is up, but I didn't have to do that. So that's why my alarm clock was on. So what we can do now, I think, is to take questions. And what we'll do, I think, is just to have a look in the chat and to see if there are any hands up. So I see already there is one hand.
Asanda's hand is up now.
Asanda, thank you, Asanda. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that enlightening presentation. I just have one question on the issue of research-led teaching. I understand you're a DVC, which is a very big profile. And how do you balance that? Because I understand, like, as you become a professor, become a full professor, you often given many responsibilities in the university. So how do you balance that, conducting research, but also, doing undergraduate teaching, which, can take a lot of time. So I'll be here really if you can offer, some insights on how to manage that. Thank you so much, Prof.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There's an old saying, and I know there are different sayings also in different languages, but, somehow those that are busy, no, I think the saying is that if you want to get something done, give it to the busiest person. Yesterday, I was talking to Prof. Marwala, our Vice Chancellor, and we were talking about, he was telling me that he's producing two books this year, and I also have two, but by the way, I'm his DVC, so I should do more, So I immediately realized, and then we started to talk about how it is that we do. Asanda, I think that my main secret is actually working with people. And what I try and do is that I put pressure on myself with others. So I will, for example, come up with a skeleton of an article. And then I will maybe draft a couple of words in the abstract, and then I'll send it over to others, and then they will start working on it, and then it will come back to me. And then I'm now under pressure because I have now started this work. I must, do something about it. So that's been the side on the research articles, is actually to, work, and continuing to supervise students was very important, and I do that to this day. But I started to lack time, absolutely. I did have to integrate some technologies. For example, I use Grammarly quite a lot with my students. In the past, I would, give attention to technical detail, but then also non-technical or academic writing detail. I didn't have enough time to do that. And so the technology to help me do that. And then it saved me some time, so I could probably do some other things. In terms of the teaching, I think, my first encounter with online education was actually in 2007 or 8, where I did work on WebEx, which was an old tool, still used today, on online learning, because I was quite a lot in the US. And so I started to have to record some of my teaching work, and it was quite useful. And my students often said that, when are you going overseas again? And I said, but why does it matter? And I have a feeling that they preferred the recordings to when I was doing the teaching. I think I was very fast on the board, And so I think the online learning environment allows for the way. And in fact, the teaching work that we are doing currently, it's actually fully recorded. And so the way it works is that we have certain, I can pick up from the recordings where people are asking questions. And then when we have session, we devote ourselves to those difficult areas where I will then go in and then make mistakes that people typically do, because we often learn by mistakes. And so this is how I have brought about balance. But maybe to summarize the answer is by leveraging technology and by working with a support system with other people. The undergraduate is not extensive, just to be clear. I do mostly guest lectures. It's more at the coursework at the postgraduate level, where we have got these online programs.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. I see we have a hand, Sabelo. Please go ahead.
So I was going to ask two questions. One is on, the influence of companies or even funding bodies in terms of what your direction of your research. And the second one is on, as we are younger and we tend to overcommit ourselves with positions and things like that. And those things can actually distract you a little bit. So I guess on my first question, I just wanted to know, in South Africa, we struggle a little bit, particularly in biomedical science, where, the grant, particularly grant companies from outside, your NIH and Wellcome Trust, they would sort of say, this is the kind of stuff that we want to fund. You either have to be working on infectious diseases or TB or HIV, otherwise we don't fund you. And then what then happens is that you find people move in their research direction, leave what they may be interested in or passionate about, and follow sort of grant, whatever funders want to fund. So how do you really navigate that? Because I think that probably was one of the experiences you talked about in companies. So my second question is around, it's very easy to be tempted with positions as younger people, to say, go be a head of division, particularly if you're from a designated group, because, maybe there's less of those people there. So maybe you're pushed towards that. What would be your advice in those kind of things? Because obviously you don't want to overcommit yourself when maybe you do want to actually expand your research interest and group and things like that. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know if I have perfect answers to these. I'll try and provide at least some imperfect views. Perhaps they will be imperfect, but maybe they will be helpful in how I navigated some of these. I think that the first aspect, if you work in an area like any of the biomedical sciences, it is quite complicated to get funding in our own system. Also, people don't always want to fund these areas because if you're developing an equipment or something that develops into an equipment, the process of clinical approvals is a very long and complex time period that is needed. So going back into my own example, I was not really interested in developing communication head devices for missiles. But what was interesting for me was the principles around communication devices. So I simply leveraged that particular piece of funding. It was maybe it was not initially even out of choice, because they had funded my undergraduate. I had an undergraduate bursary with them, and then they continued with a very long-term relationship with me. Now, what I tried to do, and so if you're working in the biomedical area in particular, say the funding call is for tuberculosis, and you are working on, say, something slightly different, but maybe still in the area of pulmonology, then tuberculosis might be a narrow component, where pulmonology may be the wider component. And you then see how that funding from NIH can bring about, that synergy in the pulmonology area. And it might not be your initial focus, but by zoning into that area of pulmonology, you may then be able to expand into other areas. of pulmonology as one example. So I think that may be the one approach. The second approach, which I found was quite interesting, was with my group of students, often started to go into these private sector companies, and we used to present to them what could be their competitive edge in 5 years, and then to say, how do postgraduate students develop that competitive edge, because it can take 3 to 5 years from master's to PhD, maybe even longer. And then once they could see that there will be a competitive edge, and then would be the question of funding. And then we will say, well, there's a Section 18A deduction, and nowadays there's something called a Section 11D deduction for when a company invests into your research. It's an R&D tax incentive. And one can leverage this kind of tax incentives to actually deliver. And the companies are what, at least the ones I engaged with, if we could give them, that trajectory may help. They were getting tax benefits, and they supported some of this work, not all of it. And that was interesting. And there I could then start to shape my own areas, including in those industrial sectors. As I gave in the example of INSIAVA. INSIAVA was a total work of our own research, our own curiosity, that then found applications much later. And it exists as a company in South Africa, of course, working in the global arena even today. Then the other aspect about designated and administrative, I must say, I actually fell into that myself. I became a research group head almost, I think, maybe a couple of months after I finished my PhD. And it brought about enormous, I will say, problems. Simply because there were things that I didn't know how to deal with, I'll tell you that the one example that I had to deal with, Neo, you will laugh, was actually a student who came, no, it was a professor who came and told me that, well, he has a case of a sexual harassment against a student, and I had just completed my PhD. I had no idea now how to start to deal with. By the way, I had gone for an induction. I had learned on how to deal with the other way, where there's a sexual harassment case coming from a student to the staff, but not this vice versa, And so it was quite complicated. It was also emotionally taxing, by the way, at the time. But somehow I was the kind, and I think maybe if you are intending to do this, is to be able to speak with people. That was very important for me. And by being able to have conversations with different people, and in fact, I remember engaging on that particular problem with a very senior academic, and he said to me that, well, after 25 years, he actually hasn't experienced this. So he said, you are very fortunate that in 2 months after you are appointed, you have this problem and then we navigated through it together. So I would say, by the way, I'm not dictating. You will notice I'm not dictating whether you should or should not do it. If you have because people are different, I would say that I benefited from getting into an administrative position in a way, because it brought to me an array of problems. It brought to me opportunities from a funding perspective, particularly. But on the other hand, some people would not want to do that. And so I would say that, it's for the individual to kind of craft your trajectory. Probably if I have a choice and if I have to lean towards one versus the other, the obvious one is to give yourself the space to develop and carve out what you think will be your main knowledge contribution area. And I think I had the benefit actually because the advantage I had because of this vertical integration that I talked about was already during my master's and PhD, I had a club of people that I was developing. And so this gave a benefit that we were not solving a problem as an individual, but always as a group of individuals. And so I think that if you are, the kind that likes to work with different people, then it becomes a little bit easier in inverted commas if you're taking on an administrative position, because you are working in that collaborative setup. But if your research requires, and some research does, to have a more single, single authored approach, if that is the nature of your discipline, I think it's better to focus on developing that discipline first and then looking at administrative positions. So I think there are some disciplinary differences and people and personality differences as well. So I'm afraid I don't have when I said imperfect answer, this is what I was talking about. I don't have a one size fit all answer in this response.
Thank you. I think that experience is very helpful.
Thank you. We have another hand, so perhaps we can ask Matabo. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Prof has been very clever in saying that he has imperfect answers, and I don't know how to ask my question now. My first question is, in terms of collaboration, the academic space is driven by competition, not collaboration, in terms of research outputs, counting numbers of outputs, what do you produce? And therefore that system goes against what you are telling us to do right now, to collaborate. So how did you navigate that in your own personal space? And how do you deal with that in your current institution to help academics to work more collaboratively and improve on their research? That is the first question. The second question is, when Prof. Morojele introduced you, she said something about being involved with the NRF. And my question then is, how transformative are the structures within the NRF? Are things transforming currently in terms of how the rating is done? Because it privileges already the privileged. Why am I saying that? Because if you look at many of I'll make an example of a Black woman academic who will have a late entry into an academic career or even further studies, and then the age doesn't allow them to apply to a certain category of rating. And then there are other obstacles on the way in terms of her getting to the kind of rating that she would want to work towards. So is that considered in looking at the ratings of who is being rated, and how then can people like that be assisted to channel their applications so that they get the kind of rating that they would require? And how can the institutions also assist in ensuring that the publication system, because the rating also looks at your publication system. And most of the journals are kind of a brotherhood where if someone is not known, your article will never get through. But we are told that we need to publish locally and internationally, and getting in is very difficult, especially if you don't have a mentor or someone who can open the gates for you. So yeah, I have a lot of questions, Prof, but I will stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, by the way, I so much appreciate your question, because some of these are really areas that has, also been areas, that I've personally experienced over time. The first aspect about, this research output, and, you kind of get one unit for one journal output and so on. Fortunately, when the institution I used to work on, you didn't get units, you didn't get money from you got very little. So it was not even a factor to think or consider. In a way, I say I was fortunate to be introduced in that way to the journey of publications, because otherwise I would be dependent by the thinking that that incentive system brought about. In my own case, if I talk about R1 million to produce a chip which is as big as your nail, that is 10 times the output subsidy that you will get from a journal article. So for me, that was never really an option. So what I thought about was that once one has a publication that is extending the knowledge body and is bringing about a new technique or a new method or so, and then leveraging that to then engage with funding partners, external funding partners, not always thinking within kind of the confines of subsidy output. You are, however, correct that different South African universities do have different incentive approaches. At UJ, we are quite generous, I would say, in terms of the output, one output unit. The funding partly goes back to the academic, not into their pocket, but into their cost center. So you can actually start to develop reliance and worry about, well, if I collaborate with so and so, it means my amount of dollar or rands that will come into the cost center will divide, But that is a little bit of a short-term type of thinking. And remember, it is natural for all of us to think about the short term. I saw somewhere that said, who ate the long term? And the answer was short term. And I think that if you start thinking from a longer term perspective, the collaborations assist, because where you were expecting maybe two out, 1 unit, you will end up getting 2 papers with half a unit or something like that. I don't always like that rationale, but I think you get the picture that through the collaboration, you end up scaling what you are able to also produce, because the collaboration will bring about additional funding. With additional funding, you can get more postdocs, you can have more postwork, you can fund and support more PhD students and so on. So I think the ecosystem of the collaboration in the long term has a higher return. The second question is around the transformative of the NRF. The NRF has to reflect on its rating, not only the rating, but other processes as well. It is looking and developing programs to especially look at the aspect around women researchers. But NRF in itself is also going through a five-year review, which will bring about consultancy, but it will bring about, the process will bring about consulting, will consult with different individuals. And I think some of you will also be engaged in this process of the review, so that the NRF as an organization, just like you saw the picture of the mirror earlier, the NRF can also have that reflection. The rating process is heavily contested. I would say particularly, I think, in the humanities and the social sciences, because it is much more subjective. In engineering science and in the natural sciences, you can still find, certain metrics having more meaning. H-index can have more meaning, but in law, an H-index may not have so much meaning as a paper cited in a Supreme Court judgment may have more meaning. But a Supreme Court judgment Supreme Court outcomes are not in the Scopus database, which is used as one of the things in the NRF system. So I think that the processes are going under review, and the new NRF strategy, which looks at the aspect of impact, amplifies what it means and how you look at how you look at the research bodies, and the T for transformation is broad, but is inclusive in terms of demographical transformation aspects. And I can definitely tell you that there are areas which we as an institution also have to look at. I mean, the fact that, you can have certain grads that will say in this day and age that if you go on maternity leave, that it is, you must not go, something like that, absolutely unacceptable. And I think that, fortunately, and I think we must really be in South Africa, you can be very critical to these grant instruments, and your voice will go into the system, and it's something that one has to look at. You know, I saw something like that a few days ago, and I wrote a long letter back on saying how unacceptable, and they came back and they said, oh gosh, you know, we're going to look at this. You know, we've used the same template as submit. The person wrote back and said, you know, we didn't update the template since 1986, and I said, you know, really. So there is work to be done, and please continue to raise the voices in all formats. The publication enterprise, some people call it the business or the game, which was your third question. This enterprise, I must be very honest that I did benefit because and maybe this is also about, you know, where you sometimes are. I sometimes say, you know, how did you get there? I said sometimes by a little bit by luck. And they said, what was the lucky part? Well, I said, well, you know, I went into a certain, you know, there was a certain, it was like a school day or open day that was taking place. And I said I was there at the right time because it may have not been. And so I think that the aspect of professional networks, identifying professional networks, getting involved in the professional network. Incidentally, I got involved in IEEE as a webmaster, by the way, at one point. And in 2014, I was elected as the global vice president of IEEE, which was the first case of person in 130 years of the history of this organization at the global level. But had I not entered in there, and it was a very interesting place because you could get and see who's who and learn about them and then see what they were doing and how did they do that? And, you know, so I think getting involved in a professional network, you know, South Africa has the SciS in the Academy of Science. The Academy of Science is another avenue. And in different professional societies, I know Professor Moragele is also quite active in her own discipline. And so identifying that is a way. And then seeing if there are people, sometimes you find a mentor who's willing to spend time directly. In other cases, you'll also find mentors by observation. My mentors initially, at least, were by observation. I was just looking at what people do. And that is, and by reading autobiographies, biographies, this was my initial introduction. I didn't know what the word mentor was when I started, actually, to be very honest. I only learned about it in the last, maybe when I went into more management roles that it became more prominently. Today is much more defined, but at that time it was not really defined. In fact, I think my father once told me that you need a mentor getting things right, you know. So that's how much it has evolved. And today, absolutely, if you can find a mentor, app is really, really the right route to take. And just remember that mentors benefit sometimes more than the mentee. They don't always admit it, though. I see a couple of questions, Neo, on the chat line. Should I move through them?
Please do. Many of them are related to the NRF, in fact. Yeah. So there's one by Kirti and so on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So collaborations is not directly measured, but there are several indirect measures. If you look at publication profiles of papers that are co-authored with international peers, you will find often that their field-weighted citation impact is high. At UJ, if I look at the aggregate among our papers, it might be even twice as high as papers that are authored by people in the institution or internal to South Africa. Then collaborations also comes about because it helps with external funding. External funding helps to support grad students, postdoctoral fellows. So that's another way that it measures. The third part, which was quite interesting, when I was going through promotion processes at my former organization, Victoria University, the one request that came about was I needed to provide 10 people who know my work and can be part of the referee group, the reference group, when it comes to supporting my promotion application. Had I not been part of when I joined a professional network, as a webmaster, I'd never known that 10 years later, I will be developing a promotion application that wants 10 referees. who will be able to vouch to the technical strength of my work. But being involved in that professional network then gave an advantage. Similarly, for NRF processes, you do need to provide people who know your work or who you have learned about them through your networks, so that you can provide their names and they can provide a critical view of your work. Of course, if you have linkages, then it's a conflict of interest, then you can't provide them as reviewers, or you have to declare that, and then it's for the NRF to decide how to use that. So collaborations in many forms are there. In my own rating forms, the description on how the international network develops different parts of the bigger research landscape and how it all integrates together to develop intellectual property that has meaning was one of the areas that reviewers found very helpful. Whereas if I didn't have those collaborators, I probably would have nothing to say then. Then the other areas around NRF ratings, I think that the NRF really does like to see a focused area of work. So if you are having, this relationship between knowledge bodies, how one works that is quite key. I am currently mentoring somebody who's on the Tutuka program, and this person is just, you can only apply for rating once you are done with the Tutuka program. But the person has already started to write the description. And I work with the person on OneDrive all the time. Every time there's a new paper, I said, do you think this shifts this or that in the rating application? So there's a process of continuous reflection and pauses, because I can see the person I'm mentoring also is very, very busy. Sometimes, if you think that someone is a DVC or something is busy, our academics are very busy. I know that my academics and our academics are maybe busier than I am. They are teaching, they are writing applications, they're doing lots of things. And so I absolutely respect that. And so I see that in the people I'm mentoring, that they are very, very busy. And so I help them sometimes to pause from what they are doing. I remember I wrote a message the other day, I said, can you just, stop what you're doing and, let's meet on a Saturday and let's have coffee so that we can talk about the things that I can see from my perspective. And so I think that's, maybe another thing to have around this rating is to see what people who have got this A, B rating, what did they do? And what were some of their learnings. And they are very kind people. By the way, the A rating individuals are actually amazing how kind they are in their approach. And sometimes you don't approach them because you think they are too busy. But you will be amazed at, at how much interested they are in sharing sometimes their experiences of 50 plus years with individuals. So approach them. If they don't respond, that's okay. But you have at least approached them. And sometimes you meet them in conferences and find time to sit with them if they haven't some people are email oriented and some people are not. People are different. But just on that, if someone doesn't reply to you and they're whatever, then don't see that as a negative at all. Sometimes people have just, it's not their main mode of communication. So I just thought I will mention that as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sinha. So we're actually coming to the end of our slot. Are there any more questions before we end, though? I think we can maybe take one more question, either in the chat or if anyone wants to lift their hands. I see Sinead has a question. Can you see it, Prof. Sinha? There's a question. Would you like to raise your hands, Sinead, and maybe just ask your question, please?
Yeah, I got it actually.
You got it, okay.
It's the Global North question, right?
Okay, go ahead, thank you.
Yeah. There is the NRF rating is a South African thing altogether. The Global North, even the Global South, they do not have this rating system. And the rating system has got pros and cons. There are also some historical reasons of how it got developed in our own context. And so, for example, being a fellow of a particular organization in the UK, the Royal Academies matter quite a bit. There are all these different organizations that one can look at, but it's not always about aiming at the highest. It's about aiming at what will give you that kind of synergy to engage with individuals who are working in your area. And so there's not some kind of an equivalent. There are legacy aspects of how that system has developed on context. I'll move to the next question. Zayed's question. I think this is the whole aspect about interdisciplinary work, because when you're working at cross fields, then it's not clear what it is that you are trying to, what is the knowledge body contribution. But I think that aspect, if you look at, for example, just now we had the release of the Clarivate Analytics list of highly cited researchers. In the past, you will not find an area that deals with cross fields. But today you will actually find that there is such a category as well. I suspect that the way that the NRF strategy is developing into the future is that it will lend to looking at, the intersect between disciplines. For example, society and technology, they seem to be so different, but unless we view them in an integrated way, there will be so many new problems that would come about. If we look at economic policies or economic policy research without thinking about socioeconomic, we will have a case of where a country may have a GDP that is growing and at the same time poverty growing at the same time. So I think that there is greater appreciation for these cross fields as aid. And so I think that when in a future application, I think if you're able to show that kind of picture of your contribution, I think there will be more appreciation in how it goes about. I've just browsed through the other questions, Neo. I think we are on track. I think I've been able to cover all of them. I can provide my email address if you want to reach out. I just want to type it. I don't know if I've typed it just correctly. Yeah, so it's there. Yeah, the full stops. I couldn't see the full stops clearly, so I can see them. So that's my email if you do want to reach. What I'd probably do is, if you do reach, is I will generalize your question without your name because of Poppy, and provide some feedback, which I'll share with Megan so that she can make it available to everyone. Of course, if your question is very personal, then I'll respond directly, but just also to give you the benefit and to give other participants benefits. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sinha. That was really, really fantastic. And it's really got us going as far as discussions are concerned. Tomorrow we'll meet again and we'll have more opportunities to engage with all of you. So we really look forward to that as well. So thank you very much, Professor Sinha. What we will do now is just ask you to kindly, okay, so thank you, Professor Sinha.
Thanks, Neo. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.